Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining me this afternoon. When we had the opportunity to do online talks, I was very eager to volunteer because I had just finished overseeing the printing and binding of the third volume in our Inside the Morgan series, The Rotunda in the East Room. So this wraps up the series about the historic interiors in our McKim building. But there is a pallet of the book sitting at the binder because we closed on March 13th, and so we haven't yet been able to take delivery. So if you are visiting the Morgan's shop page, you'll see them all on there. The books are indeed somewhere ready to be sent. And once we get back to the Morgan and on site, our bookshop will be able to send copies of all three books. So I was really glad to have the opportunity, though, to give a talk about this final volume because you know, so many of you who visited the Morgan, who love the Morgan, I know many members are listening today, we feel we know it so well. It's, you know, somewhat unchanged over the past century. But in fact, through the course of doing these three books, and since the refurbishment of the interiors in 2010, we've discovered a lot of information that really casts things in a new light. So we've learned a lot from looking at the building itself, from archival information, some early drawings, which are going to figure in my presentation today. And what I'm going to do is try and walk you through the development, all the changes in plans and decisions that were made in creating the rotunda, the great entrance hall, and the East Room, which is the wonderful book-clad centerpiece of Morgan's library. The story, of course, starts with Morgan in 1902, who decides to commission a library adjacent to his brownstone on the corner of 36th and Madison. And he reaches out to Charles McKim of the firm McKim, Mead and White. And it's really Morgan and McKim, I'm going to skip forward for a second, who you see here at left, who give shape to all aspects of the building. Morgan's very aware of what's going on. He's very involved in a lot of the decisions. The other player that I want you to meet today is the man to the right of McKim, standing in his studio. His name is Harry Siddons Mowbray, and he has a fascinating life story. He was born in Alexandria, Egypt, brought with his family to New England, where his mother died in a freak accident, and he was raised by relatives, went to West Point, and as a young cadet decided he really was a painter at heart, and then trained in Paris to become a painter. And his story comes together with that of McKim when McKim engages him to work on a project for Frederick William Vanderbilt's mansion at Hyde Park. So some of you may have visited that up the Hudson. And on that project, he gets Mowbray involved in 1897, and that is really what decides decides him to become a mural painter. So he becomes interested in decorative work. And we find that McKim then turns to him again and again in 1901 for the University Club murals in the library, and then ultimately in 1904 for Morgan's library. So the moment we're going to look at, and I'll just quickly go back to the exterior view, is when the building, so it's begun, you know, the plans are begun in 1902, it really starts developing through 03. By early 04, by the spring of 04, the building exterior is done almost to the cornice. So the exterior is progressed enough that they can now turn their attention to the interior. So what we find in the spring of 1904 is this increased attention to how these rooms will look. There's sort of a general plan, but they really haven't finalized them. So with McKim and Mowbray as part of the picture, I thought we'd start by entering in to the building and taking a look at some of the key aspects of the rotunda. And the first one I want to discuss here is the floor. Certainly anybody who enters the building is really struck by this riot of color and textures and the diversity of marbles in the pavement. And here's an early watercolor from this period in the spring of 1904, where McKim is really trying to come up with very, final enough plans that they can pursue the acquisitions of materials. So he's developed a plan for the pavement of the rotunda that's based on a Renaissance example, and you'll find that throughout the building. And here, McKim is looking to Piero Ligorio's floor in the Casino Pio in the Vatican. So he's looked at this floor that was done for Pius IV. in a small casino, a small building in which he gathered a humanist circle. So there's very deliberate choices of these models. And he looks to that inlaid pavement and designs a similar inlaid pavement for McKim. McKim designs it for Morgan's library. So in this watercolor, you can see he's got a sense of different textures and different colors that he wants. But in order to procure these stones, he needs an agent in Rome, because of course, so much of these interiors are modeled on Roman examples, but they also brought materials from Rome as well as locally sourced American materials. So we've got kind of a diversity of materials coming together. So McKim recruits Waldo Story. He's a sculptor and he's the son of the sculptor William Wetmore Story. And Waldo Story is living in Rome, and as a sculptor, he obviously knows marbles, so who better? McKim engages him at the start of the summer in 1904 to help him source some of the marbles for these pavements. It's a very stressful job to have, apparently, because the building boom in America with the Gilded Age, there is literally a run on quarries. There is so much demand for marbles coming from Rome that, you know, Story is very competitive in trying to source certain things like a porphyry disc, you know, trying to find something of the right dimensions and edge other people out who are also after the same marbles. So there's a lot of frantic cable exchanging as he's trying to get the material. And the interesting thing is that, you know, there's a very clear idea of the pavement of what's needed, but McKim asked at first for just about what he needed, about 76 square meters. But then he upped it to 86. And in the final request he makes that summer, he really wants 113 meters priced out, and he wants everything square. So he doesn't ask for the stone to be cut. He's not only asking for what he needs to lay into the pavement, but he is so concerned about coming up short and having enough marble to implement his scheme that he actually is asking for additional marble. And at this point, you know, Waldo Story is a bit surprised by the growing specs for this floor, but I think it reflects McKim's anxiety. This project is moving fast. He's got a demanding client, and he doesn't want to end up with less material than is required, because that would really put him in a bind in order to keep this done according to specifications and on schedule. And at this time, with all of this back and forth, it's interesting that McKim writes to his colleague William Rutherford Mead that August and says that he hopes all of this effort for the floor, and I quote, will help Morgan begin to appreciate the amount of trouble that is being taken to make his building a success. So already it's going this extra mile, and this sense of, you know, trying to get the absolute best materials in order to complete the rotunda floor. Now, at the same time that he's making these watercolors, you know, of the pavement, he's also done elevations for the walls and the rotunda. And again, it's a very marble-clad interior, so you've got a lot of different materials that need to be sourced. And here's an early elevation. And what you can see here is that the basic concept is pretty set. You have a doorway that leads to the librarian's office, because this is as if you just walked in off 36th Street and you're facing north. You have an apse, which here is more gold and white, but in the end becomes more blue and white. And you could see the ceiling decorations are roughly in the correct place. So he already knows his model for the ceiling. But what we have down in this lower register are a set of embedded pilasters alternating with mosaic panels. And this sort of rosy tone, the building is constructed of Tennessee pink marble. So he's making mosaic panels of the same pink marble. He's picking pilasters, marble that has a deep red wine vein in it to kind of keep with this palette. And then you can see some accent columns here on either side. And I think it's a little bit clearer in this elevation where you see this is looking back towards the entrance, and this is looking towards Morgan's own study. So you see the pilasters, but then these decorative columns flanking it that here are in a dark red. What you also see is a very strange detail above here in the lunettes, which is a sort of sculptural relief at center and two framed out areas on the side. We'll come back to that because that's one of the most compelling changes that's made in the design of the rotunda. But again, with the pilasters, he has sourced the marble, but he asks for more marble at a greater thickness than is actually needed. And so the firm that's supplying it, a farmer in Brinley, was really worried that this was a precious waste of materials. But again, McKim does not want to come up short. He wants to have enough to really implement this scheme and have it be consistent. What you see down here is a very telling detail, and I don't know if it's possible to kind of make it out here. You see some pencil lines right down where I'm pointing, and over here as well. These reflect the change that McKim makes. So originally the pilasters are floor to ceiling, as is the column. But then he comes in and he indicates a higher plinth or a stylobate that raises the columns and the pilasters up off the floor, a little bit over a foot, right? So you see that just indicated here. Now, this is an idea that, in fact, is implemented. You will see that in the rotunda here. There is a raised plinth, a raised stylobate, so you do have marble clad here, but the columns and the pilasters all terminate there in this raised base. So the question is, did he decide to raise the base for reasons of proportion, for aesthetic, for material reasons? One possible explanation I've been thinking about could be that that summer he also managed to source these columns, and you see two here. There's also two on the opposite side, flanking the entrance to his study, these green Cipollino marble columns. And the columns came from a very interesting source. And when I first learned about these columns, I thought maybe it was a bit apocryphal. Could this story actually be true? But the belief is that, or at least the story had been that, these columns had come from a chateau, an 18th century chateau that was built in the Bois de Boulogne outside Paris. So this chateau was built in 1777 on a bet between the Comte d'Artois and Marie Antoinette. And apparently the bet was how fast the chateau could be erected. And it was done in 64 days over the summer of 1777. Now, shortly after that, of course, the revolution overturned things. It was left to fall into disrepair, and Napoleon renovated it. So at some point, material from that chateau actually seems to have left and entered into the market. And so, in fact, it may indeed be possible that this rather fantastic story has some validity to it, because McKim was able to secure 4 columns the summer of 1904 and have them delivered. So the idea that that may have shaped the proportions of these columns that he was looking for, that are green rather than red, but have a wonderful provenance and history behind them, end up changing that plan for the rotunda that we saw in the initial watercolor. Now, if you look up, you'll see, of course, this glorious ceiling, and we'll focus on this part of the ceiling, which has painted decorations and stucco surrounds. And this is where our friend Mowbray comes in. Now, McKim, in those early watercolors, you could see, had already had an idea of what the ceiling would look like. And the ceiling that was actually constructed and decorated is very consistent with McKim's watercolors. And when McKim made those watercolors, he had talked to Mowbray about the commission. So in May of 1904, he enlisted Mowbray to be part of this project, to do the eastern ceiling and the rotunda ceiling. And it's really over the course of the next month or so that Mowbray develops his program for the East Room. But there was already a model in place. McKim had a model in mind. And you could see here a watercolor drawing by McKim in which he's copied a ceiling, a version of a ceiling. And we ask ourselves, what is that model? It's another Renaissance building that will not come as a surprise, but Raphael's ceiling of the Stanza della Signatura, which was constructed around 1508 to 11 for Pope Julius II. And it was Julius II's study, which also housed his library. So again, a very appropriate choice of a ceiling. And what McKim has done here is follow in these panels Raphael's design, but you'll see he slightly modified it because of the proportions of the ceiling. So here's Raphael's ceiling from the Stanza della Signatura with the 4 rectangular corner pieces, these wonderful 4 roundels with female figures. This would be the oculus in Morgan's ceiling. But then here's where he makes the change. These 2 quadrigonal panels here, it turns out with the proportions of McKim's ceiling, only one of them was needed. So it's a slightly simplified version, but closely based on Raphael's ceiling. And in fact, when McKim and Mowbray traveled together in June of 1904 to Rome to work on what they said were color harmonies. So to come up with, to take a look, I think, very directly at some of these models and come up with what would be the tones that Mowbray would use for his paintings, because he would need to get to work right after, you know, he returned. We see that Mowbray made this partial copy of Raphael's ceiling here, where he's really focused on this sort of old gold tone that he wants to capture. And you can also see a sort of dusky violet and a somewhat dull gray blue. So at that time, you know, this is really what he's thinking about in terms of the color scheme. And here you can see how one of Mowbray's roundels compares to Raphael's original. And again, Mowbray tries to use, through painting, that same sort of faux mosaic effect in the background with the gold, and is really, you know, playing a little bit with this compositional format that Raphael sets forth and adapting it for something appropriate to Morgan's library. And so just to give you a close-up of one of the roundels, you can see that, and this is all painted. He painted this on canvas and then attached it to the surface, a technique called mariflage. So this is all painted decoration here, painted on canvas. And here are the 4 roundels that resulted in Mowbray's scheme. And you see art, science, religion, and philosophy. So again, this devotion to humanism, to bringing together the arts, the thought, but also that religion is a part of this. So this is very much part of the iconography that prevails throughout the ceiling. And you find that echoed as well in the 4 rectangular panels that are at the corners, with the Annunciation, the crowning of Apollo, and then the triumph of light over darkness, and knowledge transmitted. So you have a mixture of religious subjects as well as pagan subjects, referring back to antiquity. And again, the Renaissance rediscovery of antiquity and Renaissance humanism is something that very much interests Morgan, is an important part of his collections, and therefore is reflected in the models that McKim chose, and also in Mowbray's iconographic program. And for the quadrigonal panels, he includes these painted faux reliefs. So you get, finally, as you could see in the original design, this idea of white on gold. So this is the place where it occurs. You have these wonderful little complex scenes that celebrate music and dance, but are simulating antique reliefs. So he's really borrowed that from Raphael's ceiling and developed his own compositions. And this sort of thinking is extended to the decoration that we see in the apse. So in this part, this curved portion here, you see that Mowbray's now adopted an all over white ceiling with some gold touches, but he's done the reliefs in white stucco on a blue ground. So it's changed from that gold that was in the original watercolor by McKim, but also because he was looking closely at the model of the Villa Madama. You know, again, taking an appropriate Renaissance example. This is in the Garden Loggia, and it was a building planned by Raphael and executed largely by his colleagues Antonio da Sangallo, Giulio Romano, and Baldassare Peruzzi, also from the early 16th century. So again, looking at very similar types. But the motif, of course, in a garden villa is a little bit more playful. So what we see in these octagonal panels are a little more lighthearted and amorous, in some cases, couples from antiquity. So you have, here we go, let me use my cursor here, Mercury and Proserpina, Venus and Cupid, Cupid and Psyche, Diana and Actaeon, and Bacchus and Silenus. And so you have these gods and goddesses paired in these octagonal panels that I think then bring forth this additional blue color, and you have a very unified ceiling that's combining pagan and Christian themes throughout. So it is an homage to antiquity, but also to the Renaissance rediscovery of antiquity. Now the ceiling and the work on it had progressed significantly by the time this watercolor was made. And I believe this watercolor is from late 1905 or early 1906. I'm tending to think a little bit more early 1906. So you can see, based on what we've just seen, the ceiling just as Mowbray would execute it, so very clear. The apse, very consistent with, again, with Mowbray's execution of it. The pilasters, the columns. So we get a sense of the plan being implemented, and this being an early rendering of what the interior looked like in 1906, although some work is continuing. And there's a couple things I want to touch on here. One, you'll see the issue of lighting. We've got these two Caldwell fixtures. Now, E.F. Caldwell was the leading lighting designer of the Gilded Age, and he designed the fixtures throughout this building. And here, two floor lamps that you see. There possibly were two others towards the front, so it might have been a total of 4 floor lamps illuminating the space. And of course, they look a little out of place to us. I also want you to note this doorway, which we see here, which in fact differs from the earlier elevation in its proportions, in part because McKim was able to acquire an actual doorway to give shape and proportions to that space. But perhaps the strangest part are, again, these lunettes, which we'll discuss. So you can see that if this part is done in reflecting reality, what on earth are these strange lunettes? We know the painted lunettes that are there, but here we seem to have these reliefs, just like in McKim's earlier watercolor. So here, just to show you the painted lunettes that are now in place to remind you of what the building actually looks like. So we go back to the watercolors. Now, you could see that what's proposed here is this tripartite division. So you're breaking up this lunette into 3 pieces, these sort of framed little spaces in white and gold, and the center, which has a relief in it. And if we look, I had been wondering, about those early watercolors, and was this just a rejected idea? It didn't work. Why didn't it work is usually the question you want to be able to answer. And I noticed one day when looking through photocopies of some of our archival images of the building, in part because I was actually trying to figure out what was going on, when these Caldwell fixtures left. And then I looked up and noticed, hey, wait a minute, what's going on in this upper register here? Although it's sort of blacked out, you could still see a little bit, and let me pull that in. So at the bottom of your screen now, you see the top of the photograph, and then you see McKim's watercolor. And you can see that, in fact, this was, for some time in early 1906, in place. At least the frames were. It's hard to tell if this right here actually had a relief in it. I think it's so dark, it's I think hard to make out if there's any surface there. But we know that at least the frames were in place as a placeholder in 1906. And it makes us wonder, well, wait a minute, how did we go from, this initial elevation to an actual execution of those lunettes, and then Mowbray painting his lunettes? Well, I think it goes some way to explain a little bit of what had puzzled me about a visit that Morgan made to see Mowbray's work at the University Club in the summer of 1904. So in the spring, Mowbray gets the commission for the East Room and Rotunda ceilings. In June, he proposes a program. He goes to Rome. He starts work in earnest, painting the paintings that have been commissioned from him. He is also, at the same time that summer, finishing the commission for the University Club library murals. And so he's in the U Club with all the scaffolding over it. And McKim tells him suddenly one day, Morgan's going to be on his way over there. You need to take down the scaffolding and the tarps. So he takes down the scaffolding and the tarps to make sure that the murals are visible. Morgan comes and says, oh, magnificent, superb. And it seems to me rather interesting. Like, okay, if Mowbray had already been hired for the project in the spring, what is the big deal? What is the big, so what of Morgan's visit at the very end of summer then? And I think the answer to that is, at that point, they decide to add the paintings of the lunettes. And I think that why he already had much of the rest of the commission, until then, the intention was that the lunettes would have these reliefs. But I think the decision, when Morgan saw these beautiful murals in the University Club, which are based on Pinturicchio's decorations in the Borgia apartments, which also serve then as the same models for the lunettes he does for Morgan's library. So I think seeing that University Club mural wasn't the moment that, you know, Morgan suddenly, you know, said, oh, let him do the whole of the library. But I think that's the moment where they add the lunettes in the rotunda to the commission. And of course, Mowbray follows the similar example, you know, using the Pinturicchio murals as a point of departure, but he paints them after he finishes the rest of the work that he has planned for the rotunda ceiling and the east room ceiling, which means he doesn't complete them until some point in 1906. And they're actually one of the last elements installed are the lunettes, the murals. Let me flip onto one of them, the first of them. These are one of the last things installed in 1906 in terms of paintings. So I think that kind of got tacked on to the end and was the last thing that he completed. So they framed out those lunettes that you saw before at the top of the photograph, you know, as a placeholder for most of 1906. Because remember, it was in, you know, the end of 1905 that the keys were actually handed over to Morgan. So we have to keep in mind, you know, that something was there in that interim period. Now, for the lunettes, Mowbray decided to celebrate Western culture and to celebrate the history of epic poetry in three ages: in antiquity, the Middle Ages, and the Renaissance. And so he devises the scheme for three of the lunettes. And so we're looking at the first one, which is over the entrance to the East Room. And this is celebrating epic poetry in antiquity. So you see Calliope, the muse of epic poetry, on a throne at center. And again, like Pinturicchio's, you know, you have a center throne draped with fabric, landscape in the distance. At left, Homer is seated, and at right, Orpheus. So he's developing a cast of characters around that. And I just want you to note that here, this is the lunette. It's set right here into this frame and painted. And this is the architecture. So there's a deep arch that sets back the lunettes over the East Room and the West Room. But the second of the three lunettes is going over the main entrance. And that is a flat wall, so it's not set back. This lunette celebrates the poetry of the Middle Ages, the Arthurian romances. So you have the altar of the sacred flame at center, and you have at left King Arthur and characters from the Arthurian legends, and Dante and Beatrice at right. So again, he's looking at the great poetry of the medieval world. But what he's done here is paint the rosettes and the Greek key pattern onto the canvas in order to create this trompe l'oeil illusion of an arch being there. So creating this, you know, parallel situation for the two side entrances that actually do have physical arches. He's, in effect, created an illusionary arch on this canvas, on this lunette. And finally, the lunette that goes above the entrance to Morgan's study is devoted to erotic poetry in the Renaissance. So we see seated at center, Erato, the muse of erotic poetry, and at right, there's Petrarch gazing at Laura, and characters from Torquato Tasso's Jerusalem Delivered at left. So you've got this wonderful group with this beautiful landscape setting in the background. But one other feature that you see that's a little hard to make out, but it might be easier in this slide, is that the material, the details in gold, so her harp here, all these decorative details you see that are gilt, these are actually molded and attached. So they're raised decoration. There's a real texture there. So even in the lunette with the Middle Ages, you have a raised altar. So there is a dimensionality, and the way that this would be lit from the oculus, because these are raised areas and they're gilded, they would catch the light. So he's being very sensitive to this very space-specific installation. Now I want to just return to this view to talk about a couple things. One, I mentioned these Caldwell fixtures. Yes, so we see these standing lamps in a number of them. We know Caldwell did fixtures throughout this building, but then they disappear, and we wonder, wait, you know, what happened to them, and what was the reason they disappeared? I think the reason is that in this grand Renaissance interior, especially once Mowbray's panels were installed, his lunettes were installed, they must have looked very 1905. They must have looked very out of place, even though they're bronze fixtures and Caldwell designed them for the building. So they were replaced by these 4 columns that McKim was able to source in Rome. So in the fall of 1905, he was able to source 2 columns. The 2 by closest to the door are in rose tone breccia, and he was able to get those from George Williams, the dealer in Rome. And the 2 closest to us in Africano marble were from Alessandro Marcocchia. And so he had them fitted with matching bases and finials, and then we have Caldwell coming back in to electrify these and add alabaster bowls. So he adds these bowls that have this sort of antique relief of a drunken Bacchus or Salatus here staggering around. And these bowls, we know from his stock book, originally were conceived to be part of a chandelier. So here we find in a stock book the same bowl, but combined with these columns. So I think for a while in late 1905 into 1906, before the columns were delivered, they were delivered in the spring of 1906, that later, at some later point in 1906, those columns must have been electrified and installed and adapted with these alabaster bowls, and those floor lamps be done away with. So it's definitely a move to more decorative, more colorful marble. And it's very funny because when we look back at some of McKim's watercolors, there is in some of them more austerity that gets changed during the course of living in the building. And the more they're in the building, the more things get jazzed up a bit. And so to return to that doorway, you remember like the very early watercolor sort of has a narrow doorway with a tall niche, possibly for a figurative sculpture. Well, in the watercolor in 1905, we can see that the doorway is a little bit square and it has this surround. And that's because McKim was able to buy from Stefano Bardini, a Florentine dealer, this historic doorway with the coat of arms of the Savelli family of Rome. And you could see this right at the bottom, that slice there. That's sort of where the doorway ends, and the rest of it is a little bit made up with marble and a faux finish. So he buys this chunk plus this surround, but it's empty at the time. So this is probably just a placeholder. It may be that nothing was placed in there because Morgan didn't acquire this relief until 1910 from the other dealer, Elio Volpi. And again, it's another object that has this incredible story. You wonder, could it be true? But it just might. The relief may have been commissioned in 1451 for the Manelli Chapel at Santa Maria della Quercia in Florence. And it turns out that that chapel had passed into the Antinori family through marriage and was struck by lightning and partially destroyed in the 19th century. So by Morgan's lifetime, a lot of the material that had belonged to the Antinori family had fallen into the hands of Piero Antinori, who becomes a major source for a lot of dealers. So he has legitimately inherited a tremendous amount of Renaissance material through his family, through Palazzo, through the chapel. And so it very well may be that this is a piece that was from that chapel and was put on the market and then acquired through Volpi by Morgan in 1910. And then installed, and it so beautifully complements the apse above with this, you know, white relief and blue background. But it's interesting because that really didn't come about until several years after they were really living in the building. And the final bit to mention is that there are still some mysteries. One of the mysteries is, and I don't know if you could see this right here, this detail, and I'm going to blow it up, is a cassone. And it's a cassone that sat outside Morgan's office apparently since his lifetime. And here's a picture of it now. And strangely, we have not had the opportunity to do very intensive research on this piece of furniture. We're still trying to figure out where it came from. If you look at the invoices, Morgan, first of all, he bought a lot. There are invoices for so much material. But he also bought more than one old walnut chest. So if you're looking for something described as a cassone, quite a few come up on the invoices, and you try to match them with ones that we know and figure out when this might have come into the collection. So we're still trying to figure out the details of that, and also figuring out not only when did Morgan acquire it, but also when was it actually constructed, and is it indeed Renaissance, or is it a 19th century homage to the Renaissance? So there's a lot more work to be done there. And another mystery element is one of my favorite details in the rotunda space, which is if you see these columns here, these two lapis columns flanking this doorway, they have gold bases and they have sort of inch-long tesserae of lapis lazuli covering them. And for a while they were in the East Room. Now they've been in the rotunda for decades, flanking the entrance to the North Room. But we still don't know where Morgan got them from. There's a number of stories that have come up over the years, but we haven't been able to find an invoice or a solid connection so we can figure out where they came from, you know, what their source was, you know, who were they created for, when were they created. So that's still a mystery that we're trying to solve. But the final bit goes to these doors. Now, the doors are rather compelling. So again, this photograph has so much, and just finding one photograph that tells us so much about the timeline and the decisions has been wonderful. So these doors are, you could see, carved with these, you know, beautiful panels on them, placed at the entrance to the East Room, and another pair placed at the entrance to Morgan's study. The tricky thing about them is we know they were difficult part of the project. They were designed and redesigned, and the company that made them, the Hiss company, complained in September 1905 of the constant redesigning of the doors. But anyway, they delivered them by the end of the year. So in, I think, November of 1905, the Hiss company delivers these doors. But then once they're delivered, they're told by McKim's person not to set the doors to the East Room for the moment. So the company brings them, they don't get set. Eventually, obviously, they were set in place. But we know then, shortly thereafter, in 1908, the order came from McKim to remove them, and they were removed and they were shipped to the Waddleton factory in Tuckahoe, New York. So they were a design element that didn't work, that people, you know, Morgan presumably was not happy with. We don't know why. Did they not work from a, you know, airflow perspective or something very mundane? Were they not appealing aesthetically? Did they seem out of place? So that we still haven't figured out what exactly the reason is for the removal of the doors. But they were there for a brief window, probably from the start of, you know, the very late 1905, early 1906 through 1908 when they were removed. But it is through those doors that visitors would enter into the East Room. And so in a way you have the great reveal, because you walk into this room and it still takes my breath away after being at the Morgan for 22 years and being able to walk in there whenever I want, except for now. Of course, it's such a stunning room. But the strange thing is, you know, this most beautiful space started out with a watercolor elevation that is decidedly unexciting. We've got one level of bookshelves there, a window, some fabric covered panels, and then a ceiling that seems to have these kind of some sort of romantic historical narrative playing out in a landscape, which is very strange. And you sort of think, well, that certainly underwent a fair amount of change. Now, I also have a problem with this drawing because the proportions are weird. There's no wall in the East Room that has 4 lunettes or 4 bays. You either have 5 on the back wall and all the other walls have 3. So it's a puzzling drawing, but it does suggest perhaps that this is early on and it wasn't quite clear how the ceiling would be divided or maybe what the proportions would be. But it certainly suggests that there was a long way between this first idea and where the ceiling ends up. Now, this later watercolor, I think, is, again, and it's quite nice to have these early elevations and then ones that record a different moment in the project, but not the final moment. So we get to see it almost unfolding, but there's still some issues. So again, we'll see in this watercolor, at this point, Mowbray had proposed a program. He had been painting, and very clearly we see that the ceiling looks very much like it does now, and we'll look at that in greater detail, with the zodiac panels and the lunettes alternating portrait roundels with the women representing the arts and sciences. The ley light, you can see the sky through that, so we'll talk a little bit more about that. But the biggest striking feature is that it's hung with tapestries, and it's sort of seen as a gallery for Morgan's tapestry collection, albeit for only a few. He had a vast tapestry collection. And these tapestries, of course, and the one that's shown over the fireplace is just a sort of placeholder because it doesn't correspond to the one that's there now. So this is representing an idea for hanging the room with tapestries, and then having objects atop the bookshelf. But one part that I really love about this is that you see from the beginning and from this early stage display furniture. And this is an important room for us where we display highlights from many of our collections. And that's something that has been part of the ethos of the design of this room since the very beginning. But let's take a little bit of a closer look here at what we have. So there is one tapestry that has remained in place, but this was not part of Morgan's tapestry collection at the start of the project. So we already had a vast tapestry collection. This was one that was acquired purposefully in 1906. So when that tapestry was bought from a British collection, Morgan may not have known the incredible provenance, which is that it was woven in Brussels for Henry VIII in 1535 as part of a series devoted to the 7 deadly sins. And it had been at Hampton Court in the 19th century, eventually left and entered into private hands. And through the dealer Jacques Seligman, Morgan was able to secure it in 1906. And then it has been hanging in the East Room ever since. And if you notice, excuse me, up close, that the sides and the bottom are also folded. So was it acquired with the idea that it was going to be the centerpiece and everything was going to conform around it? No, it was not. It was probably, when it was acquired in 1906 was also a time in which the scheme of having just one layer of bookshelves was changing. So these things are then made to fit together. And if you remember in the earlier watercolor, there was a flourish on top of the fireplace, which has since been removed in order to allow the tapestry, of course, to hang behind it. And here you see a little bit that the flourish that was on top of the fireplace. So already you have the 2 windows in place, you have the fireplace has already been installed. They're preparing for the first level of bookshelves. But the Morgan's nephew, Junius, really becomes involved in the project, and especially the East Room, because he is very knowledgeable about the book world, very interested in libraries, has quite a network of people around him. And so Junius, who's a compelling figure and the subject of research by our director Colin Bailey and by my colleague Daria Foner, and I think they're going to turn up a lot of new material about Junius's role in this. But we know that Junius kind of took over the situation with the bookshelves. And at this point, he was suggesting that by late November of 1906, again, things are coming together, people are in the building, but already there are major changes still happening. This is still evolving, that more bookshelves were needed. So 2 additional tiers of bookshelves would be added, which means these 2 windows covered over by bookshelves. And that the tapestry then acquired around the same time gets delivered and then has to be folded and tucked to actually fit in with the fireplace already installed and with the bookshelves that are under construction. And here you see the 3 tiers of bookshelves and how this is modified in order to allow for the fireplace and the tapestry above it. Now, in order to accommodate access to those upper tiers, McKim had to devise these staircases, and along with Junius, these pivoting bookshelves. So in order to access, this is shown on the ground floor, but this is also true of the upper 2 stories, you have pivoting bookshelves that turn from the staircase. So this goes up for 2 more flights, and the bookshelves have a handle, and you could see that here. They turn and allow access. So you have this seamless wall of books, and there's the great primacy on the aesthetics of this, but I think quite a degree of ingenuity behind making them accessible. And Junius also was very important in some innovations that enable this look. And he had a friend, a British librarian, who had developed a type of hinge that would allow these cases to open completely flat, which meant you could pull the books out with great ease. So no handles. He wanted it to be very clean, the bronze grills on the front, just a key lock. The librarian would have the keys, so they would be secure, and then they would open up fully so you could utilize the entire shelf. There would be no loss of shelf. So I think there's a lot of clever and small decisions that have added up to, I think, putting the library and these aspects of the library at the forefront of what was possible at the time. Now, to take a quick look at the floor and the ceiling in the East Room. For the floor, you see at left the design of the parquet. Now, it turns out that McKim in 1902 had been charged by Teddy Roosevelt with refurbishing the White House and doing a renovation in which flooring was needed and which Roosevelt asked for as cheaply as possible. But McKim then takes this idea for the parquet and extrapolates it, and it's roughly the same parquet that we see in both projects. The ceiling, which you see on right, is still underway. They're still working out the development, and they're still working out what the pattern's going to be, but it's always been based on a panel here and then a lay light at center for illumination in the room. And John Seaton, who was the master sheet metal worker who did the lay light and the oculus in the rotunda with this sort of milky glass. So you've got sort of a milky green and a milky white glass and a leaded pane. Again, much more decorative. And McKim's original watercolor called for, you remember, you could see the sky through it. This is really a much more decorative solution to it. So rather than just plain panes of glass, you have a more decorative pattern, and you have a little bit of complementary color introduced through the ceiling. Now for the floor, you know, the parquet design would have been barely visible because of course it was covered with beautiful rugs. Morgan had an amazing collection of antique rugs. However, the rug that you see here, the original rug that was in the East Room, seems to have been commissioned because it's so large scale and had to fill the space. So you have a rug that's been commissioned based on a famous Islamic carpet, the Arteville carpet, that's in the Victoria and Albert Museum, which is a museum very dear to Morgan and close to his home in London. But it was commissioned from a young dealer named Quill Jones, who again is another one of my mysteries. He's a bit of an elusive figure. And again, the story about the carpet seemed to be a bit apocryphal, that it was commissioned in 1908, took 3 years to complete, woven in Persia, is delivered, and then Morgan is displeased because the colors are too bright. And the whole idea of the building, this combination of 1905 craftsmanship, incorporating antique elements, is to have it, to give it that patina of a Renaissance village, the patina of age. And you know, the West Room ceiling had, in Morgan's study, had been decorated but then antiqued to made to look old. So the idea of a bright, shiny new carpet was unacceptable. But this is the part I'm not sure I believe, that Quill Jones had it shipped back to Persia and then hired what he said were 50 sturdy-footed workers to walk barefoot on it every day for 30 days in order to tamp it down, give it a bit of a patina of age, and then it's sent back and it's appropriate to that. They probably just wash it with acid. I mean, who knows? But I have not yet found shipping invoices to confirm that story, but I would love to, because that'd be rather thrilling to know that, as outlandish as it seems, it's actually true. So in addition, I mentioned that Caldwell had designed the lighting fixtures throughout the building. He also designed this great lamp that was hung in 1906 without the orb. And it's something that had since disappeared, but then we refurbished and reinstalled in the 2010 renovation of the building. And so I think it looks absolutely spectacular there. Now, just to talk about Mowbray's part in the East Room ceiling, it was based on Renaissance models. You know, McKim's idea, I think, was very much with the zodiac panels and with lunettes, was based on the Loggia of Galatea in the Villa Farnesina in Rome. Again, a structure by Raphael, or I'm sorry, I'm skipping to, I was going to switch to Raphael Guastavino, not Raphael Sanzio. So you have this Renaissance model that it's based on, and then in the building itself, McKim enlisted Rafael Guastavino and his firm, who had pioneered this timbral vaulting where you set tiles into Portland cement in order to have very lightweight vaulting. And that's what makes this cove ceiling possible, and that's what's behind the ceiling. And then Mowbray, following this very similar format, you could see, has the little creatures filling out in stucco, these panels. And then you have painted octagonal panels of zodiac scenes, and you have these painted lunettes that alternate between the portraits and the reclining female figures. And the rest of it, much like the model in the Villa Farnesina, this gold triangular vaulted space above, preserving that structure. Now the roundels, again, have this bit of trompe-l'oeil. You have a sort of faux marble surround with a painted portrait in it, with this sort of gold mosaic background. This is all painted on canvas. So even though it simulates relief, marble relief, this is all painted, and you have these grotesque decorations that vary among all of the panels in between. And to pick out one of them, just to show you, Mowbray's process and what he was looking at, you can see his initial design at left, and it's a pencil design, so it doesn't show up as strongly as I'd like, but it has his early idea for Botticelli, holding his palette and brush, painting a canvas there. And the interesting thing about the canvas is that it is a painting, and a Madonna and Child, that was believed to be Filippo Lippi, but only recently reattributed to Botticelli, and a painting that's in the Louvre. So he was very on top of scholarship. But you also can see that from this idea he had of Botticelli to where the final panel is, he obviously looked at the artist's self-portrait in his adoration of the Magi and the Uffizi, because that really then shapes what Botticelli actually looks like. He sort of ages him down and gives us the young Botticelli at right. So he's doing his homework. He's very much looking closely at these examples. And one example of Morgan's intervention in the ceiling is this panel where you see William Caxton. Now you might think, there's always one of our 3 Gutenberg Bible volumes shown underneath, in a case underneath where this is placed in the room. However, it initially was a canvas depicting Gutenberg. That's part of Mowbray's initial program in June 1904, and was actually installed. And when we did conservation work in the room in the 1990s, they could see that something had been excised. So it probably had been installed, a painted canvas with a portrait of Gutenberg, but then replaced, probably at Morgan's behest, by this portrait of William Caxton. And in fact, there's no known portraits of Caxton, but it was on a later sort of imagined portrait of Caxton, known from an engraving that Mowbray worked. And Caxton was very important to Morgan, in part because in 1902, he bought the Bennett collection, which was a large collection of Caxton volumes, and he is the first printer in English. So indeed, somebody very dear to Morgan's heart. The female characters in the lunettes, who represent the arts and the sciences, are absolutely beautiful. And again, he's introduced them to avoid monotony, to vary the pacing of the lunettes around the room. And these were based on, again, the example of Pinturicchio in the choir ceiling of Santa Maria del Popolo. And I'll just show you one of the Sibyls up close. You see a beautifully dressed woman in Renaissance costume, obviously, with the plaque tacked to a tree in the background, this mosaic ground behind her. And that's something that Mowbray then followed closely. So you see the figure for Science, which is the only signed and dated canvas in the building that he signed for 1904. She's leaning on a pile of books. She's there with an implement, and you've got the plaquettes there in the background and the beautiful simulated gold mosaic. But if you look at music, she seems to be a little less Renaissance in spirit. And in fact, here's the drawing for music, and you'd be hard pressed to sort of guess that that's what that was for if you didn't know. And to me, it always strikes me as something so much, of the early 20th century. It calls to mind the work of the Czech artist Alhan Mucha. You really have a bit of an Art Nouveau sensibility there. So Mowbray is both paying homage to his Renaissance examples, but he's also very much a man of his time, I think, when you look at his artwork. Now, the final note, and I know I've been talking on a while, is I want to talk about this explanation for the placement of the zodiac signs. Now, there are 14 spandrels with zodiac panels. There are only 12 signs of the zodiac, so 2 of them are actually mythological scenes, but they don't follow calendar order. So you may ask, why, what was the guiding principle? What was the organizing principle for this? Because we know that some of them were indeed moved around from Mowbray's original plan. My colleague, William Vokeley, I think really hit upon it years ago. He had come up with an explanation that I think makes complete sense. First of all, the ceiling, as we saw, is modeled on Renaissance examples. And Renaissance ceilings for patrons often reflected auspicious dates. So you would find that the symbolism in the ceiling is really connected to the patron and events that were important in his life. So in this case, what we see here are 4 signs that I'm going to tell you about. Now, the first 2, this one here, and the one immediately facing it, because these are, facing each other in the room, are 2 signs that are associated with Morgan. And the one at left is for Aries, and that was his birth sign. He was born in Aries. And the sign at right is for Libra. You might say, well, what's the association between Morgan and Libra? How many signs can one man have? Well, Aries is his birth sign, but Libra was his sign as a member of the Zodiac Club, which is a private dining society. And you can see Morgan at the bottom. There he is. He's brother Libra, right? And he obtained this position as brother Libra in the Zodiac Club in 1903. So the member who was the previous brother Libra was actually a neighbor of his who lived at 60 37th Street, named Peter Marier, a very colorful character who could be a subject of his own lecture. But where he comes into our story is that we know the Zodiac Club in 1895 visited him, and the notes record that the participants marveled at the electrical stars in the zodiac ceiling of his library. So that tells us that Peter Marier, Morgan's near neighbor, had a library that had a ceiling that was devoted to the zodiac or to the constellations, and Morgan's predecessor is brother Libra. So these 2 signs are associated with Morgan. So we've got Morgan's birth sign, Morgan's sign is brother Libra. So the other 2 signs. This is Gemini, which was the sign governing his marriage, Morgan's marriage to Frances Tracy Morgan. So his current wife at the time of the building, that's her sign. So the 2 of them pride of place, Morgan's birth sign and his sign of his marriage to Frances Tracy Morgan. Now, opposite that, in addition to brother Libra, we have the sign for Aquarius, and that actually marks the death of Morgan's first wife. She died under Aquarius. They got married very young, and she died barely when their honeymoon was over, at a tender age. So you have this commemorating that first marriage. And of course, this placement certainly makes sense as something, there had to be a guiding principle, and what would that be? And to give it some meaning, it certainly does record, I think, in a very, very thoughtful way and a very convincing way to me, that Morgan would have certainly engaged in that and approved of that arrangement of the signs marking those occasions. So to end with, there are indeed still more questions that arise, and I have a list of them that I'm looking into, but I hope this gives you a little bit of sense of how these spaces that we so cherish and have become familiar to us actually came about, and the changes that were involved. And sometimes it's hard to know, was this McKim's decision or Morgan's decision? Morgan communicated a lot by telephone, and he was very taciturn. So trying to get to know him and get to know the role he played is always a challenging game. But I think this helps us understand a little bit better about the evolution of these rooms and what that has to say about the building project in general, about the Gilded Age art market, and so much else. And I will just say also that having been at the Morgan through building projects and our Renzo piano expansion, I know how so many of these decisions and changes happen. And years later, somebody asks, well, why this? Or how come it's like that? And so I personally find it very satisfying to be able to explain a lot of these features and understand the decision making that went into them in creating these landmarked interiors. And so I'll just close with a slide of the series of books and let you know that if you're interested in reading more about this, eventually, I mean, you could certainly pre-order the book online, but it won't be sent until we're back on site, which I hope will be not too long away. But I can't wait to see where my research takes me next.